Thousands of people escape as Syrian opposition fighters advance in the city of Tabqa. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Al Jazeera, live from Doha. Also ahead.
For the last 100 days, my administration has been delivering every single day.
Donald Trump sets out his achievements in a speech to supporters to mark 100 days in office. The Pope says the Vatican could mediate in Venezuela as protests intensify against the government. Plus, a gallop towards change, how dressage is helping to break down barriers in South Africa. We begin with the latest developments in Syria, where US-backed opposition fighters are making advances towards the strategic town of Tabqa. The Syrian Democratic Forces reportedly control 40% of the town, which is a gateway into ISIL's self-declared capital in Syria, Raqqa. The SDF entered almost a week ago. Well, the US is beefing up its presence in Syria, with troops now patrolling the Turkish-Syrian border. They've been seen passing through Kamshili, which is controlled by Syrian Kurdish forces known as the YPG. Well, Turkey is demanding that the US withdraws its support for the Kurdish group and has moved its troops close to the border. Armoured vehicles have been moving through the southeastern province of Sanliurfa. Well, Hashim Ahilbar is live for us now from Gaziantep in Turkey. That's on the border with Syria. Hashim, so what's the latest with the fighting around Tabqa and the thousands of people who've been displaced?
Darren, the push by the SDF, which is a coalition of Kurds and Arabs, is on its way to capture more territory in Tabqa, but they're still facing stiff resistance from ISIL fighters who have built many defense lines around the city center, and it is taking some time, despite the fact that the SDF is relying heavily over the last few days on airstrikes by the US-led coalition. But they believe this could be just a matter of time before they can manage to punch a bulge in the heart of the city and then take it over from ISIL. And as the fighting intensifies, thousands of people who have been trapped there are now seeking refuge. They're fleeing the area, moving to territory under the control of Kurdish fighters in Al-Hasaka province. But many aid agencies are concerned that if the fighting continues and moves towards Raqqa, they might be faced with a situation where they might expect an exodus of thousands and thousands of Syrians into safe territory.
And Hashim, we've seen an increased presence of American troops on the ground. What's the thinking behind this?
Initially, the Americans are willing to de-escalate tension on the border with Turkey. This comes against the backdrop of the military operation that has been conducted by the Turkish army over the last few days, targeting PKK and YPG positions in Iraq and Syria. The YPG, which is the main allies of the US-led coalition in the fight against ISIL, has threatened to stop fighting ISIL unless the international community steps in and provides assistance to them, and also prevents the Turkish government from continuing its military campaign. So this explains why we have now these patrol units. But at the same time, we're having Turkish military massing troops on the border area. The elements from an explosive situation are still there because the Turkish government has insisted that it does not want to see any military presence of the YPG on the border. Turkey considers the YPG a terrorist organization, and its presence on the border is seen as a real threat to Turkey's national security.
Hashim, thank you. An American soldier has been killed in an explosion outside the Iraqi city of Mosul. His unit was advising Iraqi forces fighting ISIL in the western part of the city. Well, they're now pushing through the south of the old city. The battle there began in October, 8 months after eastern Mosul was retaken. China's first domestically built aircraft carrier has completed its maiden voyage. It's arrived in Davao City in the Philippines. It's a significant step in warming relations between Beijing and Manila after territorial disputes in the South China Sea. The combat-ready vessel was officially launched last week, but won't enter service until 2019 or 2020. Jamila Allen Dogan has more from Davao City.
Today's event is a significant one because the last time that a Chinese military ship was able to dock in the Philippines was in 2008 during the time of former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. When President Benigno Aquino was sworn into office, he took a much more stronger stance against China and against what he calls our aggressive incursions into Philippine territories in the South China Sea. But when President Rodrigo Duterte was sworn in, he said he was going to pursue a more independent foreign policy, veering away from the country's long-standing ally, the United States, and then try to build closer relations with countries like China and Russia. And today's event is a pure example of that. However, here, largely, the Chinese government and the Chinese military is still seen and regarded with suspicion. It refuses to back down on its reclamation in the South China Sea. And of course, public opinion still very much favor the United States, which has long been a partner of the Philippine military. Still, many see this, foreign policy expert, this as in fact a good step, a right balance, he says, especially during these troubled times in the South China Sea.
Meanwhile, a new shipping route has been launched between the Philippines and Indonesia to boost trade. Presidents Rodrigo Duterte and Joko Widodo inaugurated the new transport gateway at a ceremony in the southern Philippine city of Davao. From there, ships will travel through General Santos City before arriving in Indonesia's Bitung city 3 days later. Previously, crossings between the two countries took up to 5 weeks. Donald Trump has marked his 100th day in office with a campaign-style rally in Pennsylvania. He broke with decades of tradition by boycotting the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington. In a wide-ranging speech, Trump said he had developed warm relations with foreign leaders, including China's President Xi. He boasted of progress in reducing illegal crossings on the southern border with Mexico, vowing to build a wall and keep up what he called extreme vetting. And he touched on job creation, saying the economy was in better shape under his leadership. Well, some, however, marked his 100 days in office with protest. Kimberly Halkett reports from the Trump rally in Harrisburg.
The problem started as the president's speech ended. As Trump supporters spilled out of the stadium, they clashed with protesters while Aljazeera was reporting live.
About the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I apologize. I've got to move, guys.
Move and turn around!
There were just a few hundred protesters in contrast to the thousands that attended Trump's speech. Still, it took dozens of police and riot gear to contain the crowd when the violence erupted.
I love the people of this state. It's special, and it carried us to a big, beautiful victory on November 8th.
It was a rally Donald Trump hosted to thank the Pennsylvania voters that helped him win the White House. He boasted about breaking historical records, accomplishing more in office than prior presidents.
I've signed 29 new bills, a record not surpassed since the Truman administration.
And he blamed what he called the fake news media for underreporting or falsely reporting his efforts to bring back jobs, cut taxes, and restore law and order. That's why he said he wanted to be with his supporters instead of in Washington to mark 100 days in office.
There's another big gathering taking place tonight in Washington, D.C. Did you hear about it? They are gathered together for the White House Correspondents' Dinner without the president.
No one wanted to do this, so of course it lands in the hands of an immigrant. It's how it always goes down.
Trump broke precedent, becoming the first U.S. president since Reagan in 1981 not to attend the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner. But back in Pennsylvania, the dinner seemed of little interest to Trump supporters who lined up for hours to see the president.
I hope all the news media shows how long this line is. They've awoken a sleeping giant in the American people.
My favorite thing was him being voted into office. And my favorite thing to see happen is build the wall.
And despite the protests among his supporter base, Trump still yields strong support. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Meanwhile, Trump is refusing to rule out military action against North Korea a day after Pyongyang conducted its 9th missile test of the year. The missile fell apart soon after launch. He again warned the country against conducting another nuclear test.
This was a small missile. This was not a big missile. This was not a nuclear test, which he was expected to do 3 days ago. We'll see what happens.
You say not happy. What does that mean?
I would not be happy. If he does a nuclear test, I will not be happy. And I can tell you also, I don't believe that the president of China, who is a very respected man, will be happy either.
Not happy mean military action?
I don't know. I mean, we'll see.
Pope Francis is calling for urgent mediation to defuse the crisis with North Korea.
I will call the countries involved. I will call them as I call leaders from different places to work on the path of diplomacy. There are mediators, many in the world, like Norway, for example. It's always ready to help, to name an example, but there are many. The path is that of negotiations and diplomatic solutions.
Pope Francis also said the Vatican is prepared to get involved in talks between Venezuela's embattled socialist government and opposition protesters. Venezuela has seen nearly a month of violence in which at least 28 people have been killed. Rob Matheson reports.
Night falls in Caracas, and once again, angry crowds fill the city streets, calling for an end to the government of President Nicolas Maduro and to pay tribute to more than 28 people killed during nearly a month of violent protests. Many of this crowd are from the universities, there to mourn fellow student Juan Pablo Pernalete, who they believe died after being hit in the chest by a tear gas canister fired by Venezuelan police.
Today we pay tribute to Juan Pablo. We will remain here conquering the night, demonstrating that in the darkest night, students are light. That's when it's needed. When the people of Venezuela need more encouragement and hope, the students will be there for you.
Venezuela's foreign minister denies Pernalete was killed by a tear gas canister. She says there's evidence he was shot by what is described as a bolt pistol.
International media has reported that the death of this young man was due to the firing of tear gas, but it's not the case, and we have provided important and sufficient elements to go further into this investigation.
Protesters blame Socialist President Maduro's government for Venezuela's economic crisis, a crisis which the president says is down to meddling by foreign capitalists trying to force him out.
There is shortage of food and medicine, and we live in a country in a complete dictatorship where there are no freedoms. So we, as citizens, have a civil duty to join each other in protest.
The Pope says the Vatican is ready to mediate between the protesters and the Maduro government. Meanwhile, the vigils are likely to continue. Rob Matheson, Aljazeera.
Time for a short break here in Aljazeera. When we come back, we'll look at why migrants from Central America are no longer looking to the US for a new life. Plus, thousands of applications, but no jobs. Afghanistan's young talents struggle to find employment. More on that. Stay with us.
Weather updates brought to you by Qatar Airways. Going places together.
Hello there. We've been talking about the snow across in Europe, the very unsettled conditions, but how about the rain? Because we've also seen a fair amount of that. It's been pushing with this band of cloud here, and this is what it's done, of course. It's been so torrential in places, it has produced flooding. This is in eastern Poland, and there's a lot of areas that look like this. And in fact, there were over 500 visits by the firefighters to actually help people who were cut off by the rising flood waters. It is going to be a clearing picture eventually. The worst of that weather further towards the east, and then really just waiting in the wings across the north and the west. The next system. This is a picture on Sunday, beginning to push in some very heavy amounts of rain through western France, northern central areas of Spain, across into Portugal, and it kind of moves up to the north and the west on Monday. But you'll see, as it continues its journey across into more central areas, that cold air does mean a return to snow across the Alps. 21 in Madrid on Monday, 13 in London, so rather cool and rather damp, and then it's actually pretty good across the southeast, 21 Celsius in Bucharest. Warmer still further south across the Med, northern Africa. We've been seeing quite a bit of cloud in the last few days, really streaming all the way in from the west and extending right the way over to the eastern end of the Med. Not a huge amount of showers in this, maybe just one or two coastal showers, maybe one there in the interior of Morocco, but a high of 22 in Rabat.
Weather updates brought to you by Qatar Airways. Going places together.
Why is activist Stella Niazi in jail just because she expressed herself?
You cannot trample on the rights of others and you say it is my right. to abuse other people, to insult other people. No.
In an exclusive interview, Uganda's president discusses the issues facing his country as he talks to Aljazeera.
Aljazeera gives us this opportunity to understand the story in a very different way. We're there before something happens and we don't leave after.
Welcome back. A quick reminder of the top stories here on Al Jazeera. US troops are patrolling the border between Turkey and Syria. It follows Turkish airstrikes against US-backed Kurdish forces early this week. Meanwhile, the same forces have advanced in the ISIL-held town of Tabqa, forcing 30,000 people from their homes. US President Donald Trump has marked 100 days in office with an America First rally in Pennsylvania. He highlighted his achievements and again attacked the media. Trump broke with tradition by refusing to attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And Pope Francis says the Vatican is prepared to get involved in talks between Venezuela's socialist government and opposition protesters. People in Caracas have held a vigil for 28 people killed during nearly a month of demonstrations. Now, 2 candidates remain before France chooses its next president on Sunday. Centrist Emmanuel Macron hopes the votes of those who backed leftist candidates in the first round will help him defeat the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen. But their support isn't guaranteed, as David Chaytor now reports.
Brooding in the sun of northern Provence, the hard-left strongholds of Jean-Luc Mélenchon dominate the landscape. They're crucial to the political landscape as well, with no natural home for their 7 million votes in the second round of the presidential election. Their enigmatic leader appeared on YouTube and told them to make up their own minds.
You don't need me to know what you have to do. I'm not a guru, I'm not a guide.
Emmanuel Macron's support for globalization and the xenophobia being stoked by Marine Le Pen's campaign are both equally distasteful to the Mélenchon supporters. How they solve this dilemma could be crucial for the result. Huguette Bonamy is now retired, but her political principles remain intact.
We know very well that too many abstentions mean less votes for Macron. It's just like other elections. In this region, we're traumatized.
Jean-Charles was cooking a chili con carne for his children before his wedding anniversary celebrations.
With Macron, it's obvious, nothing will change. Then it becomes tricky. What can we do to stop the National Front while not voting for Macron?
The village of Viance is surrounded by traditional Le Pen voter territory. But Mélenchon attracted voters from all over France, getting to within 600,000 votes of the National Front. We joined the local headmaster for a walk down to his allotment. He said he was not prepared to abstain. Le Pen is too much of a risk.
I was wrong on Macron for the last 5 years. Maybe I'll regret it. Certainly he's a liberal politician. We get that impression from his speeches, trying to find a way and being at the center. So for that, I'm going to vote for Macron.
Mélenchon's refusal to call on his supporters to back Macron has been called an act of betrayal by the political establishment in France. Usually they unite to ensure the defeat of the far right. If they choose to abstain en masse, a victory for Le Pen, no matter how improbable, does become possible. David Chaytor, Al Jazeera, Viance.
More than 100 activists have been arrested in St. Petersburg after protests calling for President Vladimir Putin to quit. The demonstrations were against Putin's expected candidacy in presidential elections next year. Rallies took place across several cities under the slogan, "We're sick of him." Putin, who has dominated Russian politics for 17 years, has not confirmed whether he'll run. However, the 64-year-old, who enjoys high popularity ratings in Russia, is widely expected to do so. Turkey's fired nearly 4,000 workers from the civil service and the military in a new purge. They include prison guards, academics and employees from the Religious Affairs Ministry. 120,000 people have been suspended or dismissed following last year's failed attempt to overthrow President Erdogan. Turkey's been under emergency rules since then, and thousands have been arrested. Afghanistan is facing a jobs crisis. Foreign aid cuts and the withdrawal of international troops are hurting the economy. And as Rob McBride reports in the capital, Kabul, workers in all sectors are suffering.
For these workers, it can mean the difference between their families eating today or not. Waiting in the hope of a day's work that will earn them less than $10. Some are lucky. For others, like bricklayer Ghulam Rasul, who's been here since 5 in the morning, there's only disappointment. He tells us things have been getting worse in the past 2 years, and he's only worked 2 days in the last 3 weeks. On this day, he must return home to his family empty-handed.
When I leave in the morning, I know my children are hoping their father will bring back food. And when I don't, they are so disappointed. The moment you see your daughter hungry, you just want to kill yourself.
This is a country that has become reliant on money from overseas aid and foreign armies. And it's not only the most vulnerable workers who are now suffering. A good education, it seems, is no guarantee of a job. At a government department, a recruitment drive for nearly 500 graduates with experience has resulted in this: an overwhelming 25,000 applications. Young talent in a country which has failed to expand its economy to accommodate them.
So there was not a tension for a genuine natural growth of private sector and economy that will be dependent on its own and be self-sustained. So we missed that.
A young, educated workforce that is a valuable asset, but if not empowered, then potentially a source of future discontent in an already unstable country. Rob McBride, Aljazeera, Kabul.
US President Donald Trump's tough stance on immigration appears to be making the US less attractive to some asylum seekers. Central Americans escaping violence and poverty are taking refuge in Mexico instead. John Holman has more from the southern town of Tapachula.
In a hotel room in southern Mexico, Jose's tears mix with relief. We're looking at the bullet hole gangsters left in his son Elvin when he couldn't pay the extortion money they demanded. But Elvin survived, and the family fled their homeland, El Salvador. They ran north, just like hundreds of thousands of others from the Central American countries terrorized by gangs. But like many other refugees, they decided not to follow the well-trodden path to the United States, but instead stop in Mexico. And for one reason.
To go to the US, we'd need to know that the government there would give opportunities to good people looking for them, like in the past. But it seems that with Mr. Trump, they're not willing to do that now.
Mexico's refugee agency told Aljazeera that asylum requests have gone up by 150% since the month that Donald Trump, noted for his tough immigration stance, was confirmed as US president. The UN's refugee agency is trying to help, putting up Jose's family and others in hotels and flats in the southern border town of Tapachula.
People that are fleeing, mainly Honduras and El Salvador, are coming together like 12, up to 17 family members, which means their entire generation are leaving their own country because of violence, because of persecution.
While the lines of refugees queuing for asylum in Mexico are growing, international and Mexican officials say since the Trump presidency, there's also been a drastic drop in the overall flow of undocumented migrants setting out from Central America in the first place.
This migrant shelter, for example, has room for up to 100 people, but there's only 15 here right now. And what seems to be happening is that Central Americans who in the past would have headed to the United States are now waiting to see just how tough President Trump's immigration policies turn out to be before they travel.
But for those like Jose and his family, who simply had to get out, Mexico has become not just a country en route, but the end of the road. John Holman, Aljazeera, Tapachula.
At least 24 people are still missing after a landslide in Kyrgyzstan buried their village. Several houses were destroyed. Many people had already been moved after warnings of heavy rain. 25 landslides have been reported in the region since the start of the year. Now, a documentary about two former soldiers who fought on opposite sides in the Iran-Iraq war and then became friends has premiered in Toronto. The film is called My Enemy, My Brother, and has been shown at the city's Hot Docs Film Festival. Daniel Lack has more.
Careful, yeah. Okay. Have something heavy with the dolly, okay? No, that's
This is a story about the brutality of war, about displacement and loss, and the redemptive power of friendship. In the 1980s, Iranian teenager Zahid Haftlang, part of a militia, saved the life of an Iraqi soldier, Najah Abood. He caught a glimpse of what Najah had left behind when he went to war, a beloved girlfriend and a child born out of wedlock. Somehow, both men survived the conflict and spent time as prisoners of war. They each made their way to Vancouver, where they met, again, 20 years on, at a clinic for victims of torture. Zahid was there because he'd attempted suicide. Najah was distressed because all traces of his family had disappeared. The two men started shouting with joy and soon became, as they put it, closer than family.
Cousin, I cannot say cousin. It's more than a cousin, more than a brother, more than a father, more than a son. Our relationship, it's so priceless.
That story alone is remarkable, but there's much more to My Enemy, My Brother. A few years ago, Najah decided to go to Basra to try again to seek his lost family. Zahid, meanwhile, wanted to go back to see his estranged father in Tehran, who'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The two men eventually meet in Basra, each unable to fulfill their goals, but seeking each other's company. Amid intense sadness, the power of their friendship is obvious, even as they stand on the Iran-Iraq border and recall the battle that brought them together 30 years ago. It's a true story that seems like fiction, and for its Toronto-based director, it's about two men brought together, however improbably, by the country that gave them refuge.
A story like this can only happen in Canada. How could, two former enemies end up as refugees, be accepted into a country and find themselves in the same neighborhood, but also be able to become friends, to be able to put away old losses and pain, and to become friends in a new life?
This is a Khorramshahr.
A war that much of the world has forgotten lives on in memory for Najah and Zahid. But amid the tragedies, disappointments, and loss, My Enemy, My Brother portrays a relationship that's perhaps as close and unlikely as any ever shown on film. Daniel Lack, Aljazeera.
Now, dressage is often seen as a sport reserved for the privileged few. Well, now it's helping to break down racial barriers in South Africa. From Kyalami, Natasha Ghanay meets some black riders who are introducing a new community to a 400-year-old tradition.
With their regal presence, precise leaps, and synchronized galloping, it's easy to see why the Lipizaners have been called the ballerinas of horses.
I love these horses so much. There are very few people who have the opportunity to ride these stallions. So when I ride them, I feel like a king.
The breed dates back to 15th century Europe. There are only 4,000 left in the world. The primarily white stallions were brought to South Africa shortly after World War II. They've been delighting audiences every Sunday in Kyalami for the last 46 years.
It's all about the horses because no matter what we ask them to do, they do it for us. And we're their ambassadors. We're the people that have to speak for them, that have to keep the breed going and keep them alive, keep them fed and happy.
The South African Lipizaners are hoping to bring this elite equestrian world to a wider population. Last year, Shepherd Zira became the first black person to ride, and Cyril Tabide the first to perform with the Lipizaners. They're the beneficiaries of a development program catering to economically disadvantaged South Africans.
Most of us, especially the people of color, we have no idea about horses and anything because this is just a white people's sport. I would like to see more black people into, this, stop it. I would like to see more black people into this, come into this organization.
One might have to be as patient as these horses are reputed to be when it comes to change. As the men look into the audiences, they seldom see faces similar to theirs. But each time they enter the arena or teach students, they're showing how a sport steeped in tradition can evolve into a more expansive one. Natasha Ganem, Aljazeera, Kailami, South Africa.
A quick reminder of the top stories here in Al Jazeera. US troops are patrolling the border between Turkey and Syria. It follows Turkish airstrikes against US-backed Kurdish forces earlier this week. Meanwhile, the same forces have advanced in the ISIL-held town of Tabqa, where around 30,000 people have been fleeing the fighting. Hashim Al-Bara has more from Gaziantep in Turkey, near the border with Syria.
The push by the SDF, which is a coalition of Kurds and Arabs, is on its way to capture more territory in Tabqa, but they're still facing stiff resistance from ISIL fighters who have built many defense lines around the city center, and it is taking some time, despite the fact that the SDF is relying heavily over the last few days on airstrikes by the US-led coalition.
China's first domestically built aircraft carrier has completed its maiden voyage, arriving in Davao City in the Philippines. It's a significant step in warming relations between Beijing and Manila after territorial disputes in the South China Sea. US President Donald Trump has marked 100 days in office with an America First rally in Pennsylvania. He highlighted his achievements and again attacked the media. Trump broke with tradition by refusing to attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Turkey's fired nearly 4,000 workers from the civil service and the military in a new purge. They include prison guards, academics and employees from the Religious Affairs Ministry. 120,000 people have been suspended or dismissed following last year's failed attempt to overthrow President Erdogan. Turkey's been under emergency rule since then, and thousands have been arrested. An American soldier has been killed in an explosion outside the Iraqi city of Mosul. His unit was advising Iraqi forces fighting ISIL in the western part of the city. They're now pushing through the south of the old city. The battle there began in October, 8 months after eastern Mosul was retaken. At least 24 people are still missing after a landslide in Kyrgyzstan buried their village. Many people had already been moved after warnings of heavy rain. 25 landslides have been reported in the region since the start of the year. Well, those were the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after Talk to Al Jazeera. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.